I'm a programmer, and one day I noticed that the code I had written for a startup was being used in a major product without any credit. I didn't cause a scene. I showed versions, dates, and witnesses. When the facts came to light, the company had no arguments left. My boss stole my code, then he smiled like he owned the future. That smile was the last thing he kept. I'm a programmer who writes at midnight, coaxing features into life. At a hungry startup, I poured 3 months into a module that made the product sing. When the new demo launched and that exact module appeared without any credit, the thing that rose inside me wasn't righteous rage so much as a cold insistence. Facts matter. I could have screamed on social media, but screaming blurs truth into noise. I wanted correction, not catharsis. First, I built a forensic narrative. I exported commit histories, archived timestamps, captured merge diffs, and copied calendar invites that showed I demoed the feature in sprint reviews. I gathered 4 quiet witnesses, teammates who remembered pairing sessions and who still had the branch checkouts. I saved emails with code snippets I'd sent during the build. None of it was dramatic. It was an unambiguous trail. Second, I chose strategy over spectacle. I wrote a concise dossier and sent it to HR and product leadership under the subject line Attribution and IP Timeline, Request for Correction. My language was surgical. Dates, hashes, links to commits, and a short request list, attribution in docs, public correction, and written acknowledgement. I didn't haggle in public channels. I put the record where it could not be denied. But corporations have defenses: obfuscation, plausible deniability, or friendly amnesia. When polite requests met weasel phrases, I escalated, still calmly. I created a 2-minute walkthrough video that visually layered commit diffs with timestamps and a voiceover. I posted the walkthrough into an internal engineering thread addressed to leadership and asked for a meeting. The read receipts clicked back like a scoreboard. Parallel to that, I sought counsel. Ex-colleagues and a former professor helped me calibrate tone. They warned, don't be vindictive. Make the correction visible and defensible. That advice shaped my moves. I rehearsed responses to likely retorts, team effort, work for hire, no record, with precise artifacts. Diff lines, calendar screenshots, and witnesses who could vouch for when and how the work was created. The meeting felt like deploying a release candidate. I walked into a glass room with a screen, a handful of leaders, and an HR rep whose smile was already trying to soften edges. I presented the dossier. I was not theatrical. I read facts and showed receipts. Once the timeline unfolded on the screen, the only responses available were to accept or litigate. The climax was anticlimactic in the best way. The logs didn't lie. The legal team cross-checked commits, the CTO mouthed the dates, and the founder's polished deflection evaporated under simple, reproducible data. Within hours, HR drafted a correction, and the product docs were updated to include my module and my name. The company sent a muted apology. I was given a modest bonus and recognition in the release notes. The victory felt strange. Small in cash but huge in principle. Aftermath was messy in human ways. The founder retained his persona. He avoided blame but lost the monopoly of the story. Some coworkers congratulated me privately. Others kept distance as if the air had been rearranged. I thought about leaving or staying, about how this kind of revenge, methodical exposure, changes the dynamic. It didn't ruin anyone, but it did shift reputations, redistribute credit, and remind a team that records matter. I remember the nights before the reveal as rituals. Coffee gone cold, terminals tiled like evidence, my fingers tracing commit hashes as if they were relics. Compiling proof felt intimate, naming files, annotating lines, timing screenshots, until the archive read less like accusation and more like a ledger of labor. Pride here was not vanity. It was the belief that work deserves its name. Recruiting witnesses felt strange and tender. I approached colleagues as historians. Did they recall late pairing sessions, the whiteboard diagrams, the odd bug fix that made everything smoother? They replied with short confirmations. Those mundane messages became scaffolding for the correction. I sketched contingencies. If the company stalled, I'd escalate to investors. If they threatened suits, I'd demand independent verification. These weren't threats but ways to make facts unavoidable. Pressure, when applied precisely, clarifies realities without shattering them. The presentation itself was a study in contrast. My boss expected theatrics. I offered timestamps and diffs. As the screen unfolded the timeline, bodies leaned in. The CTO, usually silent, said, "These are clean." That single acknowledgement dissolved the founder's polished denials. You could watch narrative give way to evidence. When the internal correction appeared, it wore corporate language, but the kernel was honest. Release notes were updated, documentation credited my module, and a pinned Slack message recorded the change. The applause in the channel was awkward but real. Clients noticed and messaged congratulations. One asked if I could consult on future work. The irony, code used to steal credit now restoring it, felt almost comic. There were costs. Some colleagues labeled me a troublemaker. Others kept their distance. Meetings carried a new edge, and the founder smiled less. The company did not implode. It adjusted. Reputation, once performative, hardened around verifiable facts. My revenge was not dramatic violence, but a chain reaction triggered by immutable logs. It was nuclear in that the smallest particles, timestamps, diffs, emails, combined to produce an irreversible reaction. I didn't seek to humiliate. I sought correction. The satisfaction came from watching truth do the work that charisma had tried to steal. If there's a practical moral, keep records. Don't hoard them like paranoia, keep them like stewardship. Commits, emails, calendar invites, they are tiny anchors. When light hits them, lies get brittle. So tell me, would you compile a dossier and force a meeting, or walk away for peace? Would you pursue a public reckoning or a quietly precise correction? Was my method fair, or merely cold? What would you have done in my place? The ledger closed, the smile faded, but the code remained with my name. My boss thought the correction would be the end. But the truth. It was only the prologue. Because while they grudgingly gave me credit in the release notes, something had shifted. I could feel it in meetings, in Slack threads, in the way my boss avoided eye contact when I spoke. He didn't fire me, maybe HR had warned him off, but he started freezing me out. Features I proposed were dismissed. Tasks assigned to me were trivial, maintenance heavy. It was a classic corporate maneuver. If they couldn't erase my name, they'd try to sideline me until I quietly quit. And I'll admit, for a week or two, I considered doing just that. Quitting. Walking away. But every time I opened the repo and saw my commit history, a stubbornness dug deeper into my chest. They wanted me invisible. Instead, I decided to become unavoidable. The first step in my new revenge wasn't technical. It was social. I started documenting everything. Every trivial bug fix I handled, every proposed feature I submitted, every rejection from leadership. I kept a personal mirror of the Jira board with screenshots and timestamps. Why? Because if they wanted to paint me as unproductive later, I'd have a second ledger. Next, I began to polish my code like it was meant for an audience larger than the company. Every comment became crisp. Every module contained clear diagrams. I used literate programming style notes, not because anyone asked for them, but because I knew someday they might become exhibits. This wasn't code anymore. It was testimony. Then I started thinking bigger. If they had stolen once, they might steal again. So I began building hooks into my work, subtle markers in style, little fingerprints. Not malicious backdoors, not sabotage, but signatures. Idiosyncratic variable names that referenced obscure literature, comments written in a distinctive rhythm, test datasets with patterns only I would recognize. If my work appeared elsewhere without credit, those fingerprints would expose it as clearly as DNA. But here's where the revenge turned nuclear. I realized I didn't need to stay confined to this company's sandbox. The code I'd written wasn't bound by NDA. It had been greenlit under an open source license, something leadership conveniently forgot when they presented it to investors. They treated it as proprietary, but the repo itself lived on GitHub under MIT. And MIT means freedom. So I quietly forked my own work into a clean, personal repository. I stripped out company branding, rewrote the README, polished the docs, and released it under my own name. I didn't shout about it yet. I just let it sit there, public, indexed, waiting. Meanwhile, inside the company, leadership doubled down on their narrative. They started demoing my module to potential partners as the core IP of the product. I sat in presentations where my boss described it as something we've been developing internally for months. My teeth nearly cracked from holding back laughter. Internally, I was the sideline developer. Externally, they paraded my work as their crown jewel. But every parade leaves footprints. The moment of escalation arrived during a town hall. Investors were on the call. Leadership unveiled a slide deck bragging about adoption metrics for our proprietary engine. That phrase, proprietary engine, was the spark. My screen lit with anger. Because there it was, plain as daylight. They weren't just stealing my credit, they were rebranding open source as closed IP to lure money. That's not just unethical, it's fraud. I didn't speak up then. No, I sat still, camera muted, expression blank. But inside, my plan shifted from correction to exposure. If they wanted to weaponize my work against truth, I'd turn their weapon against them. For weeks, I prepared. My personal repo. I expanded it. I added extended documentation, tutorials, use cases. I wrote Medium posts explaining the architecture, complete with references to my original commits. I gave the project a memorable name, catchy, simple, Googleable. Then I started sharing it on dev forums, Reddit threads, Stack Overflow examples, niche Discord groups. The traction came fast. Within 2 weeks, my repo had stars and forks climbing. Developers tweeted about how clean the docs were, how easy it was to integrate. A small community formed around it. Ironically, the very clarity I had added as testimony became a magnet for adoption. Inside the company, leadership didn't notice, yet. They were too busy prepping for a new funding round, using my module as their centerpiece. I knew because I'd quietly joined the investor mailing list. A trick. Don't underestimate how often companies accidentally CC the wrong people. Screenshots, again, became receipts. The climax built slowly, like a drumbeat. Investors, curious about the proprietary engine, began Googling. And what do you think they found? My repo. My posts. My fingerprints. The exact codebase, public and free. At first, I saw a trickle of odd Slack messages from leadership. Hey, are you aware of this repo with similar functionality? I played innocent. Oh, really? That's interesting. But behind the scenes, I was watching traffic analytics spike on my GitHub page from investor-linked domains. Then came the explosion. A major investor confronted the company during due diligence. Why are you claiming this is proprietary when it's publicly available under MIT? And why does the top contributor on GitHub not match your CTO? Silence. Then scramble. Then chaos. The company tried damage control. They argued it was a coincidence. They claimed the open source project had borrowed from them. But timestamps don't lie. Commit histories don't lie. And my fingerprints, the quirky comments, the test data patterns, the variable names, were undeniable. The investors didn't just walk away. They demanded explanations in writing. Legal got involved. HR panicked. And suddenly, all those weeks of being sidelined turned inside out. My name was now radioactive. Impossible to erase, impossible to spin. That was the nuclear strike. Not sabotage, not malice. Just the weapon of undeniable truth, amplified by visibility. By the time the smoke cleared, my repo had more traction than the company's actual product. And the leadership. They weren't just embarrassed. They were exposed. Investors don't forgive fraud lightly. And me. I sat back, watching the storm unfold, sipping coffee while GitHub notifications rolled in like victory confetti. So here's my question for you. If a company stole your work, would you quietly release it to the world and let the truth do the damage? Or would you fight internally until they had no escape? Was my revenge just, or too much? What would you have done in my place? My boss smiled into the camera as if nothing terrible could touch him, and then the call from the lead investor punctured that smugness like a pin through a bubble. The week after my repo went public and the investor due diligence began to unravel, the atmosphere in the office changed from thinly cordial to palpably dangerous. I arrived Monday morning to find an email chain with subject lines that read like weather warnings: urgent, IP clarification, request for immediate documentation, legal hold. My inbox filled with calendar invites I hadn't been asked about. HR wanted a wellness check. My boss's messages became terse, three-word strings that suggested a man used to ordering rooms but now forced to whisper apologies into corners. The correction I had wanted had mutated into a slow, public unspooling that neither I nor he could fully control. Inside the company, the cracks multiplied like stress fractures across glass. Teams that once collaborated suddenly circled their projects like lifeboats, afraid of contamination. The PR team drafted statements that simulated contrition without admitting culpability. The CTO took to calling long meetings about attribution processes that mostly involved explaining why they'd missed their own email history. The founder who had smiled through the first correction now moved through the hallways with the gait of someone who knows that the past, once visible, becomes a ledger that can be reopened at any time. Investors demanded documents. Legal asked for copies of everything I'd shared. The board convened emergency sessions, and I watched, oddly removed, as the machinery I'd helped build began to choke on its own smoke. The first immediate consequence was the pause of the funding round. Slides that minutes earlier had promised growth and domination now looked like confessions under a microscope. Questions from outside probed supply chains, IP provenance, licensing details, and whether the company had misrepresented assets. The word misrepresentation carries gravity. It opens doors that lead toward audits, regulatory scrutiny, and, sometimes, litigation. The company's execs scrambled to craft language that reassured investors while avoiding self-incrimination. Their drafts read like hedge fund poetry: elegant ambiguity, no commitments, a lot of breathing room. But investors are not moved by euphemisms when capital is on the table. The main backer froze wire transfers pending a forensic report. Other potential partners paused integrations. The product demos lost momentum overnight, as if the market had somehow smelled doubt and recoiled. For me, the fallout was a strange blend of vindication and a creeping, uncomfortable power. I had set out to retrieve credit. I had not set out to be the person who toppled a funding round or destabilized colleagues' livelihoods. Still, watching the dominoes fall was an education in leverage. Visibility is a blunt instrument. It corrects errors but also exposes institutions to consequences they hadn't anticipated. My repo, the clear timestamps, the public history, these were not weapons I had brandished in anger so much as tools I polished and put into the light. Once illuminated, the company's story could not be reconciled with the public record. That gap between story and record is what did the damage. The founder called me into a meeting that felt more like a ritual than a negotiation. He tried to charm first, a performance of humility he had never previously bothered to rehearse. "We're all on the same team," he said. "This is unfortunate." In the same breath he tried to imply that my actions were reckless and could harm people. He wanted a private settlement, a retraction, a quiet patch. He wanted me to agree to terms that would seal the repo, rewrite release notes, and sign an NDA that would make future discussion legally risky. It was the old playbook. By silence, restore surface calm, continue. I declined. My refusal was not a moral purity so much as a pragmatic stance. I had published under an MIT license. I could remove nothing from public view. The repo was out in the open, and its record was immutable. The conversation pivoted from charm to threats thinly veiled as legal concerns. They spoke about disruption to our pipeline and duty to investors. The tone turned cold. I left the room and felt the warmth of the hallway like a different country. Legal now took the center stage. The company hired outside counsel who excelled at prose that seemed to say a lot without actually making an accusation. They asked for access to my personal messages, for a list of who had seen my drafts, for a timeline of when I had started publishing. I complied selectively. Professionalism is part of a record too. I handed over the sanitized dossier I had originally prepared, with commit hashes and witness statements, but I withheld personal notes and strategy memos that had no legal requirement to be disclosed. Their subpoenas were procedural avalanches. Mine were curated. I learned quickly that you can be transparent without handing over every private thought. There is a line between evidence and ammunition, and I was careful not to put more than necessary on the table. The media, like rain after a drought, found traction. A tech blogger with a taste for telling David and Goliath stories picked up the thread. Startup accused of rebranding open source work as proprietary. That headline carried a narrative weight investors could not ignore. The post cited my public repo, quoted my Medium exposition, and included a short interview where I said what I had to say. Facts matter, records matter, attribution matters. The founder's response, a tightly controlled statement about internal review processes, read like corporate therapy and did little to calm the wider industry chatter. Other outlets picked up the story. Commentary separated along predictable lines. Those who cheered my exposure, those who called me a whistleblower, and those who fretted about the collateral damage to employees who had nothing to do with the decision to misrepresent. Inside the company, the human cost became real. Colleagues who had previously welcomed me now watched their own files and histories with newfound paranoia. Meetings about roadmaps turned into investigations of provenance. The DevOps team found themselves answering auditors. A junior engineer burst into tears one afternoon, convinced their own personal contributions would be contorted into evidence in a corporate inquisition. I tried to be gentle where possible. I sent private messages offering support, clarifying that my fight was with leadership decisions, not with the people who had filled tickets and fixed bugs. Some replied with gratitude. Others did not reply at all. The social fabric of the company was fraying, and my role in that unraveling was both direct and accidental. As the dust settled into a new topography, leadership attempted to rebrand again, this time with more caffeine and less swagger. They announced a review of contribution policies, a new open-source liaison role, and a promise to rewrite product docs to reflect outside dependencies. It read like repentance, but actions speak in a language investors watch closely. The board demanded a change in governance, tighter documentation of IP provenance, mandatory licensing reviews, and external audits for any code declared proprietary. The founder was forced to step back from day-to-day product talks. The CTO had to produce an audit trail proving their claims. Reputation, once a currency, can devalue overnight. I watched as the man who had once smiled as if he owned the future now found his credibility discounted. People asked what I wanted next. Some expected triumphalism, a press release announcing the victory, a badge of honor. Others advised quiet exit, take the moral victory and find greener pastures. I did neither quickly. Instead, I did something quieter. I hardened my boundaries. I made the open source project a real community, set up a governance structure, invited contributors, and established a code of conduct. That step put distance between me and the company while also channeling the energy into something constructive. Building a community is slow work. It is the opposite of a takeover. Yet the community's existence was itself a rebuke to the company's earlier claim of proprietary ownership. Where they had tried to close and monetize, I had opened and shared. There were surprises among the rubble. Some colleagues reached out months later to say that the crisis had been a wake-up call, that the company's culture of skipping due diligence had been more pervasive than any of us had thought. A few left to join other teams or start new projects, citing the turmoil as impetus. The founder's next startup pitch deck, which I later glimpsed on the internet, treaded carefully around claims of proprietary technology. It had learned humility, or learned to hide hubris behind stricter legalese. That kind of slow cultural correction felt like a small victory. Systems change not only when people are prosecuted, but when processes are rewritten and codified. In the end, my revenge never needed spectacle. It was a chain of small, precise actions. Publishing, documenting, sharing, and refusing to erase the public record, that forced accountability. The result was messy and costly in human ways, but it also created space for better norms around attribution. The company paid a price in reputation and funding opportunities. Some people lost jobs, some found new paths. I gained unexpected respect in the wider dev community and received invitations to speak about ethics, licensing, and the practicalities of protecting one's work. The irony is that the most powerful tool I used was not anger but clarity. Clear commits, clear documentation, clear public availability. So here's the question I leave you with, because every story of revenge hides a moral puzzle. If exposing the truth risks harming innocent colleagues and destabilizing livelihoods, is exposing it still the right move? Would you prioritize systemic correction at the cost of short-term pain, or walk away to preserve immediate well-being? Would you publish and let the world decide, or fight quietly within the walls and hope for a private fix? What would you do if you were holding the commits and the receipts? Under normal circumstances, startups rise or fall on market whims, but after the exposure, ours began to collapse under its own gravity. And the irony? I barely had to move a finger. By the time my repo had gone semi-viral and the investor funding had been pulled back for further review, the company's leadership was already tangled in knots. Lawyers and auditors were circling, employees were gossiping in Slack side channels, and the founder, once a peacock in meetings, now shuffled in late, eyes ringed, voice brittle. I used to fantasize about shouting him down, but the silence he carried now was a louder humiliation than anything I could have orchestrated. Still, revenge isn't complete when the villain merely looks embarrassed. It's complete when the system that enabled him begins to crumble, and everyone sees the truth in high definition. That's what part 4 of my story is about. The fallout as reputations burned, alliances snapped, and the company began eating itself alive. The first major fracture came from inside. One of the mid-level engineers, let's call her Lisa, was quietly fed up. She had defended the leadership once, but when she realized she had unknowingly been pulled into the fraud by demoing my module at conferences, she snapped. She came to me privately, her voice trembling, and said, "They told me it was proprietary. I trusted them. I stood in front of 100 people and sold your work as theirs. Do you understand what that feels like?" I did. And that conversation gave me an idea. Instead of keeping everything centered on my repo, I encouraged Lisa and a few others to write their own accounts. Short, factual statements of what they had been told, what they had demoed, and how they later learned the truth. No accusations, just timelines. Within weeks, 3 separate engineers published Medium posts about their experiences. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't just me, the angry coder, versus a company. It was multiple insiders corroborating the pattern. And investors love corroboration almost as much as they hate liability. The posts gained traction. Reddit threads blew up. A journalist contacted me, saying, "Your story alone was interesting, but now it looks systemic." That word, systemic, is death for a startup. It doesn't just mean a mistake, it means rot at the root. Meanwhile, leadership scrambled like chess players trapped in checkmate. They tried pivoting the narrative. The founder began holding transparency meetings, where he claimed the situation was an unfortunate misunderstanding of licensing, not deliberate fraud. He plastered the word miscommunication across every slide. But those meetings backfired spectacularly, because employees recorded them. Snippets leaked where the founder stumbled, contradicted himself, or brushed off direct questions with hollow phrases like, "We'll circle back on that." Within days, clips hit Twitter. One showed him insisting the company had developed the code in-house, followed by a screenshot of my repo with the same commit timestamps. Another clip showed an employee asking if leadership planned to apologize, and the founder freezing like someone had unplugged him. These weren't just receipts, they were memes. And once you become a meme, you can't spin it back into credibility. The climax built on 3 fronts. First, the board panicked. Investors threatened lawsuits, and the board decided someone had to be sacrificed. The founder was temporarily relieved of operational duties, pending an investigation. In startup speak, that's exile. Watching him slouch out of his own creation, stripped of authority, was pure poetry. Second, the CTO, who had smugly defended the proprietary claim, was caught trying to quietly rewrite GitHub histories to erase inconvenient commits. Problem: you can't rewrite the internet when forks already exist. Screenshots circulated, exposing his edits. In developer circles, reputation is currency, and his was now counterfeit. Third, clients who had bought into pilot programs discovered they'd essentially been paying for free open-source software. Refund demands hit the company's inbox like artillery. Some threatened legal action. One particularly angry client forwarded me the letter they'd sent, just to let me enjoy the spectacle. And me. I didn't gloat loudly. I didn't need to. I simply kept updating my repo, answering developer questions, and publishing thoughtful posts about attribution, ethics, and open-source stewardship. The more professional and calm I looked, the worse the company seemed in comparison. They raged in silence. I thrived in daylight. But let's be honest, part of me did savor the theater. I watched Slack screenshots of meltdown conversations where leadership accused each other of betrayal. I read leaked emails where the PR team begged for talking points that didn't exist. I listened to recordings of all-hands meetings where employees openly laughed when the new interim CEO tried to restore morale with empty phrases. And then came the nuclear flashpoint. A national tech magazine ran a feature titled, "When Startups Steal: The Case of the Rebranded Open Source Engine." The article laid everything bare. My repo, the timeline, the employee posts, the investor retreat, the founder's downfall. It was long-form journalism at its sharpest, detailed, damning, unforgettable. And because it was published in print as well as online, the company couldn't bury it with SEO tricks. Copies landed on desks of VCs across the valley. From that moment, the company's reputation was ash. Job candidates ghosted them. Partners withdrew. Employees updated their LinkedIns en masse. Within 2 months, the once buzzy startup was reduced to a skeleton crew, limping along only because winding down too quickly would invite even more lawsuits. But here's the most satisfying twist. While they were imploding, my project exploded. Downloads of my repo surged. Companies that had cut ties with my former employer reached out to me directly for consulting. I wasn't looking for fame, but opportunity has a way of finding those who hold the receipts. Suddenly, the code they had stolen became my calling card, my portfolio, my launchpad. Their attempt to erase me ended up spotlighting me brighter than I could have managed on my own. It's funny, they thought of revenge as a dramatic duel. In reality, revenge was just letting the truth breathe. All I did was build a clean, verifiable record and step back while arrogance did the rest. So now I'll ask you, was it too much? Did I go too far by letting the company collapse under the weight of its lies? Or was it simply justice catching up with them? Should I have stepped in to stop the bleeding once my name was cleared? Or was it fair to let the fallout play out? What would you have done, watching your boss lose everything to the very receipts he mocked? He thought losing investors was the end of his nightmare. But the real ending, the nuclear one, was still waiting to detonate. By the time the magazine article hit the shelves and my repo had become a staple reference in developer forums, the company was a hollow shell. Employees were fleeing, board members were in damage control mode, and the founder who once strutted through the office like he owned the future now sat on the sidelines, nursing his pride like a broken bone. I could have walked away then, satisfied. But revenge has a funny way of asking, are you done, or are you ready to finish this properly? I wasn't done. Not yet. The final stage of my revenge wasn't about humiliation, it was about permanence. Companies collapse and founders rebrand. In the startup world, reputation can sometimes regenerate faster than code compiles. I wanted to ensure the truth couldn't be rewritten, not by clever PR, not by selective memory, not by glossy pitch decks. My goal wasn't just to win. It was to etch the win into stone. So, I built a chronicle. I compiled everything. The original commits, the emails, the Slack threads, the Medium posts, the investor letters, even transcripts of those disastrous transparency meetings. I curated them into a timeline, a clean, accessible archive that showed exactly how the theft unfolded, how the cover-up collapsed, and how the truth emerged. Then I published it on a simple site under my name, a living case study in what happens when arrogance meets receipts. I didn't frame it as vengeance. I framed it as education. I called it the Attribution Ledger. Within weeks, professors teaching software ethics were linking to it. Law blogs dissected it as a modern example of intellectual property disputes in open source. Developers shared it as a cautionary tale. And the best part? Every time someone searched the founder's name, or the company's name, or the product's name, the ledger appeared on the first page of results. My revenge wasn't loud anymore. It was algorithmic, quiet, permanent. Meanwhile, the founder tried to rise from the ashes. He attempted to pitch a new company, a new product, under a new name. But investors Googled him, saw the ledger, and politely declined. Recruiters passed. Former allies ghosted. He still had money, sure, but influence? Gone. His name was now fused with the very story he had tried to bury. And every attempt to move on just reignited the conversation. The CTO fared no better. His Git history edits became a meme in developer circles. At conferences, people whispered about him like he was a cautionary fable. He applied for senior roles, but hiring managers asked uncomfortable questions about transparency and commit hygiene. Eventually, I heard he left the industry altogether. Maybe that was fair. Maybe it wasn't. But when you build your career on stolen credit, don't be surprised when trust evaporates. And me. I didn't just win, I evolved. My repo became a foundation for a new open-source community. Contributions poured in. Companies integrated it openly, proudly crediting the project instead of hiding it. I spun up a consulting business helping teams integrate and extend the framework. Ironically, I built the very career the startup had promised me, but without the chains of their exploitation. At conferences, I was invited not just to talk about code, but about attribution, ethics, and the hidden power of documentation. People listened, not because I was the best programmer in the room, but because I had lived through the fire and emerged with a story. A story that resonated with anyone who had ever been overlooked, exploited, or erased. Revenge had given me more than satisfaction. It had given me a platform. The final nail in the coffin came almost accidentally. 6 months after the collapse, I received an anonymous tip. The founder was still trying to quietly sell the remains of the product to a mid-tier company overseas. He pitched it as legacy proprietary technology with proven adoption. Sound familiar? I didn't rant. I didn't post an angry thread. I simply sent the buyer a link to the ledger. Within hours, the deal was off. And just like that, the founder's last escape route crumbled. He wasn't just beaten, he was radioactive. No one wanted to touch him, not with a 10-foot pole, not with $1 million check. That was the moment I finally felt it. Closure. And yet, here's the truth no one tells you. Nuclear revenge is satisfying, but it's also heavy. Watching people lose jobs, watching reputations burn, knowing I had lit the match, it doesn't feel purely sweet. It feels complicated. Vindication mixes with guilt, satisfaction with melancholy. Because revenge isn't just about them. It changes you. I sometimes wondered, had I become colder? More calculating? Or had I simply learned what power really looks like? My colleagues called me a hero. My enemies called me ruthless. The reality is I was just stubborn, a developer who refused to be erased. But when I look at the ledger, when I see new developers citing it as inspiration to protect their own work, I know it was worth it. Not just for me. For everyone who's ever had a boss smile while stealing credit. For everyone who thought their voice didn't matter. For everyone who's been told to be a team player, when that really meant stay silent while we take what's yours. My revenge wasn't just mine anymore. It became a warning. A precedent. A story others could lean on when facing their own battles. And maybe that's the most nuclear thing of all, turning one act of theft into a movement for truth. So I'll leave you with this. If someone stole your work, would you fight until they lost everything, or would you take the high road and walk away? Was my revenge justice, or overkill? And if you had the receipts in your hand, what would you have done?